Hello to the audience. My name is Daniel. I'm a member of BC Heritage Fairs Society Alumni Council, and today I'm interviewing Miss Ashley Henriksen of Know History, an organization that sponsors the work that we do. This is part of a series that the BCHFS has been doing, in which we discuss things with the people who support us and the work that we do. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that all around Canada, we live on the traditional and unceded lands of Indigenous groups. As I reside in Vancouver, they are the Coast Salish, that is the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. It is our responsibility as Canadians to understand the darker aspects of our history, something that has become very important as of late. Today is the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a solemn event in which we reflect on our country's past wrongs and unite to correct their legacy. Now, Ms. Henriksen, would you like to introduce yourself and the Indigenous lands they live upon?
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. That was a great beginning. My name is Ashley Henriksen. I'm the Manager of Marketing and Business Development at Know History. And as Daniel said, we're very happy to support Heritage Fair and excited to get to speak with you. I'm calling in from Calgary, so I'm here in Blackfoot Territory in Treaty 7 and also home of Métis Region number 3.
Right. Thank you very much. So my first question for you today is concerning how you've become a member of the Know History organization. So it is, how has the work that you have done led you to this point? That is, what role have your previous accomplishments played in shaping you into who you are?
Yeah, so I went to university originally because I wanted to become a teacher in social studies. I've always loved history. And then when I was doing my education degree at the University of Lethbridge, it's a great program because you can do your education degree and a bachelor. So my bachelor was in history, so I got to take lots of history courses. And during that, I really, learned how much I love history and also learned that there are jobs in history. I think coming out of high school, I didn't know you could be a historian or a public historian or a curator, that those types of positions existed. So going through university, I saw that. And then when I finished my B.Ed, I stayed on and did a master's in history. And from there, I went to work at the Galt Museum, which is a museum in Lethbridge, and I was the museum educator. So in that position, I sort of used both degrees, the education degree and the history degree, to do research and then deliver programs for K-12 students. And then I was very happy there in Lethbridge, but my husband, very luckily, he got into med school here in Calgary. And so we relocated to Calgary, and I think, as most people are, like, nervous about what job in history I could find in Calgary. And I was very excited to learn about Know History. And Know History is a research firm, and we do work with different groups across the country to research, document, and share their history. And I was very excited to see that there's a job like that and that they had an office in Calgary. So I applied. That was about 2 years ago. And then I've been here for 2 years. I started as a research associate and moved into a senior associate role, which is just like a different type of research. And now I'm doing this role with marketing and business development, which has been really exciting, and you get to see the business side as well.
Yeah, that's kind of funny because I'm currently doing a class in entrepreneurship and marketing. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see how these two subjects are tied together.
And this and it's interesting with history, because I think the way what we always say is the way you develop business is you just go meet people and make relationships, because if someone is going to entrust you to tell their story and do their history, really you're not developing business, you're developing a relationship, because that's going to be the what makes them trust you enough to let you work on and tell their history.
Yeah, I agree. And so this kind of leads us to our next question. What inspired you to join Know History? For that matter, why do you hold a passion for history?
Yeah, I always say, I think lots of people who go into heritage or history as a career, maybe our dirty secret as a sector is that lots of people get interested in history as children through historical fiction. And I think we don't like to admit that, and perhaps there's proper historians look down on historical fiction as inaccurate. And of course it is, it's not meant to be accurate, although some more than others is accurate. But honestly, like, as a child, that's what got me interested in history, was historical fiction, movies, documentaries. And yeah, that set me sort of on the path that made me interested in applying for a place that's called Know History. That's quite a history-centric focus. Our one of our slogans is "We are historians." So yeah, that's how I ended up here. The love of history led me to a company that's passionate about doing history. So it's a pretty clear line.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting story. So when I was making heritage fairs, a tool that was frequently used was the 6 historical thinking concepts, a set of ideas that assess the significance, consequences, and ethics of events. So do you have a similar system or toolbox during your studies of history?
Yeah, I saw this. I thought that was a great question, because in education, of course, we talk a lot about the big six, and it's a really good model. And what's so interesting is I think historical educators have almost better explained and defined what historians do than historians themselves. So I would say, as a historian, we do use the big six all the time. And when we write proposals, we're answering those questions. We're talking about historical significance and change over time. But it's so very well articulated in the big six that, yeah, it's almost easier to talk. Like, I find that now that I'm not in an education role, I'm in like a history role, I rely on the wording that has been provided by the historical thinking group to communicate what we do, because they've articulated it so much better than I think a lot of historians do, which is great. So yeah, I think it's totally key. It's what we do every day. Really, it is a very accurate representation of the skills that we do.
Yeah, I quite understand how it's become kind of integral to, historical education, because in my work for the BCHFS, I've done a lot of blog posts and videos regarding the 6 historical thinking concepts, and they summarize history far better than I ever will.
Yeah, it's very well thought out. I think and it's so interesting to see. I'm always interested in curriculum and the way the big six has worked its way into curriculum, and like the changes that has made in how we teach history in Canada is very impressive.
Yeah, and that's also very relevant to the next question. So, which historical figures kind of inspire you to do the most? Which historical figures inspire you the most to do what you do?
Great question. So I am sort of at my heart, I suppose you'd say, a social historian. So what I'm always interested in is the regular people. I did my MA, my master's thesis was on children and families in Southern Alberta in the First World War, rural families specifically. And so that's always sort of been my interest, is the everyday people as opposed to big movers and shakers has been where it lies for me. And so to give you a specific answer, during my master's thesis, there was a woman who lived in Alberta and her name was Isabel Brooke. And she had like 5 children, and she and her husband went overseas to serve in the First World War, and she ran the farm and took care of all the kids and all the finances while he was there. And I just think that's a pretty inspirational story. Not someone who's going to get a statue, but someone who, really, really did amazing things.
Yeah, there's a project that my class had to do a while back called Eminent Persons, which talks about these sorts of people that are very overlooked, but still influenced a lot of history, especially in their communities and stuff. I'd say that this Isabel Brooke certainly falls into that category.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So thank you very much for answering these questions. This leads us quite nicely into the challenges we face today in regards to the processing and interpretation of history, as well as the issues that continue to hinder many groups. So first and foremost, as the terrible legacy of systemic racism against Indigenous peoples becomes more and more apparent, are there things that you feel need to be taught more in Canadian schools in regard to the repression of Aboriginal groups?
Definitely. And of course, today is also the first day for National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And so, of course, there's been, big process, and lots of different groups like the NCTR have been encouraging more and more of the truth to be told in the school system. And that's an important step. But of course, there's still really long ways to go. And unfortunately, we had some Facebook posts out from our company that were promoting events that NCTR was putting on, an Orange Shirt Day, and we saw in firsthand, the racism that's still out there and the misunderstanding. So there is still a lot of work to do, and yeah, the school system is an important place to do it.
I agree, yes. So what changes do you suggest that we make to the media we surround ourselves with every day? For instance, are broadcasting entities becoming too politically skewed? And should they focus more on certain things in order to ensure that concerns of minority groups are being addressed?
These are the big questions. Yeah, I mean, media is so controversial and so difficult. One thing in Calgary that I think is working really well is we have, I wouldn't call it like an alternate media, but like a local media. So there's some they happen to be young, but some young journalists who I think are doing really great sort of like on the ground journalism. And maybe that's an interesting way to go, to have the balance of different voices. And so that's I think what's really important, that you're hearing from diverse groups of people, are getting to share their opinions through the news, and having, not just a couple of big outlets controlling the industry, having space for lots of different voices, I think is key to having a more thorough understanding of what's going on in the world.
Definitely, it's very important to have like lots of diverse voices so that we don't end up telling a single story. Have you seen that TED Talk about the single story?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting video. Yes. So, cultural appropriation and stereotyping are things that have long plagued many groups. Like you brought up that example of how there's still plenty of racism and misinformation out there. So, what do you feel is something that we can do on a day-to-day basis to help rectify this incorrect practice?
Yeah. So as historians, we think about this a lot because we work with other groups to tell their story. And I think that's really the important piece there, is that you are working with other groups. So what is not okay for historians to do, which historians used to do a lot in the past, is go into specifically an Indigenous nation and do history about them without them. So the really important part for us, and what we're always doing, is letting communities lead. So they come to us and say, we want to do an oral history project. Can you support us in this way? And we provide feedback or support depending on what they need. And that's really the important part, not for us to come up with a bunch of questions that we think are interesting and do them without the consent of the community.
So generally trying to listen more to the groups themselves instead of just propagating ideas that are spread by people who didn't experience these sorts of things firsthand, right?
Yes, beautifully summarized.
Thank you very much. So yeah, it has to be said that if we ever overcome these issues, that's not going to be a mean feat. It's somewhat ironic how these issues have been around since the dawn of humanity, and detrimental as they are, only a few generations ago were they finally reconsidered. And this brings us to the next section of our interview, which is the future of historical education and related areas of studies. So firstly, there's a saying that's been remarked by many that goes, history repeats itself. Perhaps you've heard of it. There have certainly been many parallels between events throughout the ages, though whether or not this statement is applicable to all circumstances has yet to be defined. So what is your outlook on the phrase, history repeats itself?
Yeah, I mean, there's especially when you think about how much history there is, I think one of the things historians always do is someone will say, this has never happened before. And historians, and have to the people will be like, oh, but it did. There was this time and this time and this time. And so I think history, things are changing and evolving, but there are certainly things that are repeating, and so many things have happened that, things do repeat themselves. And of course you can try to prevent that and circumvent it, but it does often happen.
Yeah, that is true. Yes, sometimes things that we don't want to happen again, they resurface somehow. Like just 100 years ago, there's a doctor who sounded very similar to many of the medical authorities today, who pushed for all these certain practices and was rejected. It was during the 1918 flu pandemic, I believe.
Yeah, it is funny that it was exactly 100 years on the dot.
Yeah. It's these sorts of coincidences are very strange, and we certainly don't want to repeat them. This leads us to the next question. During the Byzantine Empire, an individual named Anna Komneni, who lived during the 12th and 13th century, wrote a great deal about her years as the daughter of a king. Her accounts have now become one of the most prominent resources for studying this particular era, though undoubtedly many others like her did similar things. So what factors do you feel influence this turn of events? And do you feel that such a situation will occur again in the far future, in which one person's works become the sole or most significant record of our era? If so, what is your recommendation regarding the prevention of such an event?
Wonderful. So as a Canadian historian, I don't know this topic particularly, but it is interesting that she's the daughter of a king. That seems to be likely why her story was saved. And I'm pretty optimistic, but I do think we're making big steps in preserving more voices now. And like archives and museums especially are working hard to not just save that elite voice. And although it's great that we have this voice compared to none, but I think I think it's really clear that we're doing a lot better at preserving a breadth of voices. There's still work to be done, but that historians looking back at us in 100 years are going to have a much larger sort of historical record to draw from than we do looking back now.
Have you ever visited one of the upper floors of Vancouver Central Library? Like of a Central Library, they have archives and everything there. Have you seen them?
No, I haven't, not in Vancouver.
Because there's this one time I visited such a library and it contained lots of records, and hopefully, or if historians are to ever look back on this period, they have a more extensive database than we do of the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about. I mean, it almost seems like they're going to have too many records. I think like all the things that are on Facebook and the internet, how you would sift through that and begin to interpret that as like a blessing and a curse. It's a bit easier to get to. It's hard to work with a limited set of sources, but I don't know what people are going to do. How will you analyze Facebook in 100 years? There's just so much content on there.
Yeah, at least historians have a lot of primary sources to work from.
Yeah, they will. There will be no shortage of, you could study anything from like sourdough bread and cats. There would be a million different stories to tell just there. So
definitely, yeah. So what advice would you like to give to young historians and heritage fair creators?
Oh, great idea. So first, I love Heritage Fair. I got to run Heritage Fair at the Galt. I think it's a great program. My advice would be to pick a topic you're interested in, not a topic you think the judges will be interested in, because it's going to shine through, and you're the one who has to make it your passion and do something really interesting with it. And then I'm a big fan of sort of pushing the boundaries. So the 3 trifolds are beautiful, and they're one way to communicate information, but not to, and I mean a 3-fold trifold, the classic Heritage Fair setup. Not to put yourself in that box, like use that if it fits to tell your story, but don't let that limit you. Maybe there's other ways you want to share the research you've done.
Yeah, there are many creative ways of sharing heritage fairs that have been documented on the website of my organization. There are some people who set up dioramas and things. It's really amazing how you can convey what you've learned in many different ways. Thank you very much. And my final question for today, actually, as we begin to grasp the consequences of this digital age that we find ourselves in, it becomes very clear that social media could be used for either good or evil in terms of the information circulated regarding past events, especially in the context of historical negationism. So with that in mind, what role do you feel social media plays in the understanding of the darker aspects of our past?
Yeah, I think lots of information gets spread on social media. And I also think historians are working more to, get good research out there and to find interesting and engaging ways to share accurate accounts of the past and historical research. But they're certainly up against a lot because, like we said, the internet is just such a force and there's so much out there and it can be biased and misleading, and it's definitely something difficult to contend with.
Yeah, I agree. So thank you for answering all my questions. That's about it. This has been a very enlightening conversation. It was a pleasure to hear your opinions regarding historical education. The topics you brought up certainly have to be discussed today, as they are undoubtedly relevant and affect many groups. So thanks again for participating in this interview and for sponsoring the BCHFS.
Wonderful. It was great to get to chat with you. So thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you very much as well.